Dr. Ferran Perez, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's a joy to have you with us today. And before we kick off, I'd like to introduce you to our audience. You're an assistant professor in international relations of East Asia in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. You were awarded an ESRC postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Warwick, a postdoctoral fellowship at the Open University of Catalonia in 2024. You were also awarded a small British Academy grant to study Chinese elites and the production of knowledge. Your work has been reflected in El Pai, in La Vanguardia, and Publico, in various journals. And most interesting is the themes and the three perhaps narratives that you've been studying very deeply: the transnational elite connection between Chinese and Western non-state actors and their impact on world politics, the formation of non-Western transnational elites and networks and their impact on world politics, and the relationship between the Chinese international relations scholars, Chinese state, and the formation of Chinese ideas about the world politics and the world. So with all of that amazing background, I want to welcome you to BRI Dialogues and to kick off with the first question. So Juan, most people see China and Europe's stagnation as two separate stories. Europe is stagnated in more ways than one. It's deindustrialized, high energy costs, tariffs from one side, exports from China from other side. And your work on transnational elites suggests they might be two sides of the same coin. What's the hidden winning connection and wiring connecting between them?
Mm-hmm. The thread connecting all of this is the rise of transnational elite networks during the era of neoliberal globalization. Now, of course, elite networks have always existed, but what makes the networks that emerged from the 1980s to the mid-2000s distinctive is their role as transmitters of specific ideas about economic policy and world politics. They didn't just exchange information, but they actively promoted neoliberal economic thinking, narratives of economic interdependence, and a very particular way of behaving within international organizations. So what I find especially interesting about the two outcomes you mentioned, so China's rise and Europe's stagnation, is that both are deeply shaped by how European and Chinese transnational elites align themselves with this neoliberal context and by the strategies they adopted to manage the risks that come with economic integration. So take China, for example. So Chinese transnational elites engaging with Europe certainly played the game of economic integration, but they did so in a highly selective way. So they never lost sight of the fact that if a state loses autonomy and control, integration can easily destabilize its internal power structure. So many of these networks were linked to China's party state and were influenced by the Chinese Communist Party's understanding of power and how to navigate globalization. And now compare that to Europe. So when Europe transnational elite networks took shape, they often seem to forget about the importance of power and autonomy. So, and in my view, this opened the door to some of the problems the European Union faces today. And this is quite revealing when we recall debates in Western academia during the 90s. So I remember scholars like Susan Strange, Ernest Otto-Zempiel, James Rosno, Antonio Negri, and others were already speaking about the decline of the state, imagining a world in which states will dissolve into transnational networks run by technocratic elites. And in China, this kind of thinking never took root. Even today, when Chinese higher scholars talk about globalization, the state remains their starting point. So the foundation for building networks and projecting power. Some even understood economic integration as a potential source of underdevelopment, not progress.
Uh, Ferran, that's a fantastic start. Your pioneering work on global IR and Chinese IR in particular, and you have an outstanding book on that. I know because I've read it cover to cover. Um, talks about a different approach to international relations. Obviously, I mean the book is voluminous and it's very intricate, but obviously you rightly associate currents of thought to state actions and state identity. So, for people who are not familiar with that kind of thinking in China, how would you say Chinese IR is different from the traditional Western IR? And what is their starting point and approach?
Yeah, so what I would say is that one way to think about the production of ideas about international or international thought, we need to think about the context in which these ideas emerge. And this means that when we think about the production of international thought in China, we need to place it in a context where China had to basically catch up with Imperial Japan in the early 20th century, to catch up with the Soviet Union, and then with the West. And that really shaped Chinese international thought in very profound ways. So, what we see in the context of Chinese international thought is how the starting point of the production of Chinese international thought is the state. Why? Because they understand that without the state, you can't catch up with more advanced states. You can't really protect the autonomy of the state. And of course, they do this in different ways. They do this by recovering traditional political thought. They also do this by kind of blending Chinese ideas with Western ideas, or they even do that through the adaptation of Western IR theory into the Chinese context, right? And this is something that perhaps we haven't seen in Western academia, right? I remember what I was saying, that in the West, for example, especially in the 90s, we talk about the collapse of the state, the formation of a global community. This never happened in China, and that had to do with the fact that they always theorized having the state in mind as the starting point of their production of knowledge.
That is very interesting. We live in I think, a very different world today, Ferran, Juan. And that is that China is the champion of multilateralism and, global trade, and the savior of the status quo in many ways, which is mind-boggling. Who would have thought about it? Now, you track the Chinese billionaires, the elite, I would say, and many of them, in think tank heads or the Jack Ma's of the world, many of them on circles such as Davos, panels, university boards. When the Western elites go native in Beijing's networks, who exactly is capturing whom in a sense of intellectual, I would say, immersion? And do they really say in their own heart, oh my God, shit, these guys have cracked it properly better than us. But then they have to come back and still say, no, we have the neoliberalism and everything is tickety-boo despite poverty rates going up. What's happening there?
This is a very interesting question. I think there's a widespread belief, especially in popular culture, that elite networks or transnational elite networks are all powerful groups made up of people who achieve whatever political objectives they want. But basically, this perception exists partially because these networks do operate in highly asymmetrical power environments, and many of them are successful within those settings. My research, particularly on US and China and Western transnational elite networks, show a much more nuanced picture. So these transnational networks actually serve multiple functions. So for instance, they can act as informal forums to manage geopolitical tensions. A clear example is what happened during the US-China trade war in 2021, when the Ford Foundation funded events in China that brought together Chinese and Western IR scholars precisely to discuss how to de-escalate tensions. So in that sense, these networks often function as a track 1.5 or track 2 diplomatic channels, so spaces where elites can meet in more relaxed settings and operate with a certain degree of insulation from high-level power politics. They're also used to diffuse particular forms of knowledge about economics and world politics. So during China's opening up, we know that the European Union and the United States and other countries actively promoted certain economic ideas through transnational networks that connected their institutions with Chinese actors and, most importantly, with the Chinese state. But crucially here, the Chinese side consistently exercised its own agency. So selectively embracing some ideas, modifying others, and rejecting many. So I imagine similar dynamics will unfold today as China develops its own transnational networks aimed at influencing, let's say, European policymakers and other European business and intellectual elites. But these interactions are never one-directional, as we tend to think. After all, elites are not robots. And they join these networks for many different reasons, right? Sometimes for influence, political influence, sometimes for learning about the opponents, and sometimes for more prosaic motives, like gaining social mobility or securing prestige in a world order that feels increasingly fragile and in which traditional pathways for elite formation might be disappearing.
Right.
And it's a quite interesting phenomenon.
Ferran, I mean, your work helps open so many doors and windows onto the relationships within the Chinese circles, but also between the Chinese elite and the rest of the world. There, I'm sure you've been following this growing paranoia about Chinese soft power in the West. That, closing doors to Chinese ideas, Chinese technology, Chinese students, even, and so on.
Yeah.
Do you put that down to tensions in inter-elite relations, or do you think it's a direct response to Chinese growing presence, influence, and Europe and America's inability to contain that growing influence? And by influence, I mean actually power of ideas, or is it about power of finance? Where do you put the balance?
It's a very good question. You see, like I think it's a bit of everything that you have said, to be honest, Anush. But I also think that, especially when we think about soft power and Chinese ideas, I think in the West we tend to overestimate the power of those ideas, especially in Europe and the US. I think that due to different factors, historical factors, ideological factors, I think that the worst scenario for Chinese soft power in Europe is that the business elites, the political elites, the intellectual elites, they don't securitize its relations with China, and they feel that maybe they can learn something from China. But I don't think elites in the West are going to buy into the whole discourse about what China is doing in the world. Also, even if we look at China's influence in the global South, now I'm working on a project on China's in Kenya, and something that is really puzzling in mainstream academia literature is that we tend to think of soft power as a linear process. So the idea that, okay, so if China is trying to promote soft power, let's say in Africa, then African populations, intellectuals, business elites are going to passively accept that. And we don't even think that all of that might fail or even might be selectively embraced by African elites. So something that I have discovered in the context of Kenya, which is hopefully an article that I will publish soon, is how in many cases, in the global south, people don't believe in Chinese ideas, but they join those networks as a way to achieve social mobility and prestige in a context where it is increasingly difficult for them to access Western channels that will also enable social mobility and prestige. So, actually, what we are witnessing here is how elites in the global south and the populations in the global south, they want to be part of that because they want social mobility and prestige, and not so much because they fully embrace Chinese ideas about world politics. And this is something that we don't understand very well. And I'm hoping to write about, well, I'm hoping to publish something about it soon.
But Juan, I think that is very interesting. That's part of, I think, the historical, I would say, aloofness of the West, that we think that this, global South countries have no agency in their thinking.
Mhm.
And when they look at, the alleviation of poverty of 400 million people out of abject poverty and the speed to get out of that pothole, economic pothole, China's model is much more attractive, one would argue, than the deteriorating quality of, public finances, infrastructure, deindustrialization in the Western Hemisphere. In your recent piece, Farewell to Revolution,
Mhm.
Inside Chinese International Theory After Mao, do you see that there is are contours that, Europe, as a matter of fact, is confused between these two agencies of United States as the hegemon and China, and at the same time that China is abandoning that revolutionary
Mhm.
mindset, talking about global civilization initiative, global, governance initiative, and the rest of it. What
Yeah,
is
I think,
happening?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, no, no. As much as we are worried about how the Africans will react to China, shouldn't be more worried about what Europe's reaction is to China?
Yeah, I think you see, I think Europe is now going through some of the ideological processes that states like the Soviet Union and China experienced earlier. So in both of those contexts, for example, Marxism began as a form of practical knowledge, so a way to understand reality, act on it, and potentially build a better world. But over time, Marxism became ossified and it shifted from a theory meant to inspire political action into a dogma used to justify political decisions. So, in the context of China during the 90s, the intellectual Wang Hui described this transformation as a process of depoliticization. In my view, something similar is happening today in the European Union. So of course, we know liberalism has very different philosophical foundations from Marxism. But if we look back at the United States in Europe until the 70s, liberalism had a much more pragmatic character, and its leading thinkers were to some extent creative and responsive to social and economic realities. I think today, liberalism in Europe seems to be undergoing a process of depoliticization because it is increasingly treated as a dogma rather than a flexible framework for political action. And the problem with this intellectual shift is that it creates an ideological structure that prevents policymakers from thinking outside the box, something that, in my opinion, is urgently needed in the current moment. So, liberalism has become a source of collective identity. So, it is mobilized to protect, let's say, Europe's ontological security, to affirm who we are in contrast to the others. But this very same ideological posture is limiting the capacity of European leaders to take bold and innovative decisions. And without those decisions, Europe basically risks sliding towards economic decline, social fragmentation, and even the rise of new forms of soft authoritarianism within its own borders.
And Ferran, the way you frame this is really enlightening. Um, and you're right. When you look back 30 years, um, I'm reminded of at the height of the Brexit referendum, where the pro-Brexit crowd were saying, We don't need experts. We no longer need basically learned knowledge. And I fear that echoes to this day. And in my own mind, I put that down to the political economy of European states that actually, because the engine of change itself is grinding to a halt, there is no room for intellectual creativity.
Yes.
And you see it in budget after budget, in policy after policy, right across Europe. And of course, United States is now a dumpster of that kind of thing. Whereas the others of the world, not just China, you look at India, for example, you look at the Republic of Korea, you look at Japan even under this very right-wing government, you sense, and Taiwan, you sense a degree of energy which, as you rightly say, used to belong to the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Do you see this as a political economy clash? Do you put it down to rise of the East precisely because of the strength and confidence in themselves, and then the imbalance with Western decline, as it were, being this dialectical relationship, or are the two bound together umbilically, and that as one rises, the other one will rise, or as one rises, the other one declines?
Very difficult question. I think someone might tell you that given how the global economy works, until now, the rise of a state has meant the underdevelopment of other states. And that might be true, but I also think that in the context of China, and especially since the financial crisis, what we see is how increasingly, even though Chinese elites they are very concerned about the state of the world, right? They have a lot of confidence in their own model, right? That has to do with decisions that were made, with the recognition that they are doing better than the West. And also, and that is kind of that type of mindset is trickling down to the population, right? You can see levels of political satisfaction among Chinese that you don't see, for example, in the European Union or even the US, right? I think, and of course, I guess that when the Chinese or East Asian people, they see the decline of the European Union or the decline of the US, they think, okay, we are doing something right. We are doing something that is working and we should stick to this, right? So I think it's a combination of all these factors, some of them related to the way how the political economy works, right? And some others have to do with governance and how that governance is perceived, and also the tangible results of that governance, right? Which is what matters.
I want to ask you a question. You're an assistant professor. I think Durham has one of the largest concentration of Asian students. And then we see these pressures of international students, the fees, the, admissions.
Yeah.
Are we possibly going to see in 20 years what happened to the automotive industry and the education industry? And if I were to open an FT in 20 years' time, would I see the top 5 Chinese universities above other universities? One, because of the sheer size of this hunger for learning, passion for education, and bottomless funding that could come, blended with people who are now studying, with you and with Anush, and will go back to induce and inject that intellectual capital in their own institutions.
Yeah, I think you see, like in terms of the university rankings and what we'll see, I think the answer, it's very similar. I think it depends on who governs Europe and the UK in the coming years, and whether this government will recognize the strategic value of universities. And this is something that I've been thinking about. So if Europe ends up with soft authoritarian governments that promote a toxic form of anti-intellectualism, and they securitize these relations with China and with Chinese students, right? I think universities as we know them might disappear. or might be transformed into highly technological and depoliticized institutions designed to primarily compete with China. And in my view, that will mark the end of Western soft power. And it will also place Europe in a very difficult position strategically, because global politics has never been only about technological innovation and transfer of technology. And that's one of the reasons why many students, they come to the UK to study, right? Or they used to go to the US to study, right? The West. And maybe I'm too humanist here, but world politics and the global economy cannot be reduced to Taiwanese chips and robots, really. Whenever I hear people argue that Europe's future lies in technological innovation, I get worried, because if that's really the future, then China is likely to outcompete European universities. China simply has a larger pool of well-trained researchers, and its state-sponsored recruitment programs are attracting brilliant minds, some of whom are leaving the United States because of xenophobic and short-sighted policies under figures like Trump. And Europe runs the risk of doing the same. But there is another path. So if European politicians decide that universities, and especially the humanities and social sciences, are worth protecting, then Europe might still have a chance to compete globally, including in higher education. So Europe's strength has always been in its philosophical pluralism. And for many students, for many kinds of students, the opportunity to engage with forms of knowledge that are not entirely state-led is immensely appealing. So that diversity of thought is a kind of intellectual soft power in its own right. So, and this might sound a bit Eurocentric, so your audience might forgive me, but I do think that Europe cannot afford to lose its humanistic spirit. So it would be a serious mistake to follow those in Silicon Valley who advocate for a kind of dark enlightenment or an uncritical technofeticism that then is going to shape this innovation in universities. And if Europe goes down that route, it risks abandoning one of its greatest contributions to global civilization. So the ability to think critically, creatively, and ethically about the world. And this is something that students really, really like. And we can't lose that. It would be a terrible mistake.
We hear you loud and clear, Ferran, absolutely. And you're wise to raise the alarm about this. That, you know, in past years, the West had always had this kind of the confidence of arrogance that it can continuously rise above value chains, that it can dispose of industrial production because somehow finance will come in. It can dispose of finance because somehow technology will come in. It can dispose of technology because somehow AI will come in. And it had this perception, rightly or wrongly, that it can continue to outcompete everybody else till China comes and challenges the West on virtually all of those frontiers that I've just raised. And then there comes a time in capitalism where you literally run out of space. It is almost impossible to continuously provide value added and so on.
Yeah.
And one of my concerns when I don't sleep at night is we are actually reaching the crescendo of capitalist crisis. And China is, of course, embedded in that.
Yeah.
So looking at, if you agree with this paradigm, looking at this, China in many ways, ironically, becomes the savior of the system, right?
Yeah.
From your perspective, how are they looking at this unraveling world? And do they worry about, do we need to save it, or shall we move on and bury it for our vision of the new capitalist order?
That's a very good question. I think they're very concerned because they still fear that they can't control everything that goes around them, to be honest. And I think one of their main concerns is the closure of economic openness. I think this is not very well understood in the West. So when we think about China's economic policy, and the ways in which they promote economic openness, we tend to think that it's kind of form of maybe neo-imperialism, and I'm not entirely sure about that assessment, but the way how I think about this is that the reason why China is promoting economic openness is because they need that to be able to transform its internal structures within China. Without the economic openness, China cannot really protect itself and cannot really change and transform its economic model. And to me, in many ways, this willingness to defend economic openness, which is a kind of legacy of neoliberalism, it reflects the structural weaknesses of China. So it's very interesting because we tend to think of this as a strength in the West. Oh, China is kind of doing this to gain political control. It's a strength of China. But I think that it reflects some form of structural weakness. And we tend to forget that. I also think that what they are trying to do, especially in the global South, I think is by allowing the global South to develop, it's a way to delay some of the challenges that emerge with or that come with capitalist development, right? It's one way to delay some of the problems that Europe and the US are or have, right? And that allows them potentially to think about or to think in the long term about how can they actually tackle some of these structural problems embedded into capitalism. But I think this is work in progress because I think that a potential solution is the so-called digital economy, right? Which might help them to deal with some of these contradictions of capitalism, right? But still, there's a lot of work to be done, in my opinion. And yeah, that's how I might answer your question. I don't know if I answered it properly, but that would be my answer, really.
So the name says it all. Juan Ferran Perez, a Spaniard sitting in Durham, a European sitting in Durham, having studied deeply the, flows of capitalism, the, elites. I am sure you remember the days of the golden era of David Cameron and George Osborne. I think when the era of pewter, so we went from gold not to silver to pewter, So what do you think is UK's standing, not any longer as a European, but through the eyes of an international relations professor sitting in Durham as a European? Is UK playing its cards properly in this special relationship with the United States, which the NHS prices of drugs are shooting up just to please Donald and the rest of it? Is UK, given all the historical relationship ties, Hong Kong, the rest of it, good and bad, playing it smart? And could not UK be actually the house, the bridge, the base for bringing China and Europe together rather than trying to play second fiddle to the United States?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the UK is a very good example of what happens when a country bets everything on transnational elite integration and in the process loses political autonomy. I think since the 90s, 80s, sorry, I think the UK's economic and foreign policy have in many ways been strategic mistakes. And paradoxically, in my opinion, these decisions have accelerated both the internal and external decline of the UK. I'm not a UK foreign policy specialist, but based on what I have read and seen, it seems that some policymakers in the UK believe that possessing nuclear weapons was the ultimate marker of political autonomy. But the military power alone doesn't create autonomy. Political autonomy also depends on ensuring that the relationships between transnational elites and state policymakers don't undermine state capacity. And that's something Chinese policymakers understood quite well. So you have to manage elite networks so they don't hollow out the state. And the UK, by contrast, now finds itself with too little state capacity to design or implement the kinds of policies needed to deal with the destructive forces reshaping British society and politics. And this erosion of state capacity is in large part the result of political arrangements among elite networks that were prioritized over long-term national autonomy. So in 2024, for example, Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced a new foreign policy vision labeled progressive realism. And in principle, it sounds promising. But the core question is, so how can the UK meaningfully pursue progressive realism abroad when it lacks the state capacity to support progressive policies at home? So a central pillar of realism is autonomy, it's sovereignty, and yet these concepts have been neglected for decades in British foreign policy. Without state capacity, they become empty signifiers. So the idea that Britain affirms rhetorically, but cannot enact in practice. I think now the UK is at a crossroads. The decision made in the coming years will determine whether Britain becomes geopolitically relevant or whether it can serve, as you said, as some form of balancing power in the 21st century. And in many ways, these concerns also mirror the dilemmas facing the European Union as well.
Ferran, your wisdom surpasses your youthfulness. Typically, it's very insightful what you say. And as you were speaking, I was reminding myself of the latest rejection of UK's EU kind of love affair, and that is that the all important appears to be the all important defense industry integration, where Brussels set a price that it knew, I suspect, that UK cannot meet, and yet it goes out and gives Canada discounted access to the same. Do you interpret this as integration of a North American ally into the European Union at the expense of Britain? Or do you see this as marginalization of Britain because EU is finally looking away from this little island to opportunities which are presenting themselves precisely because of Trump administration's strategic mistakes?
Difficult question, huh? I'm not sure, to be honest. I think, you see, my feeling is that these days the UK is too dependent on the US, and then that has an impact on the way how the European Union relates to the UK. And that's a huge problem, in my opinion. I tend to think a lot about this, and I haven't reached any conclusion that is going to answer your question. I think as an hypothesis, I will say that the fact that the UK relies a lot on the US is having an impact, a negative impact on the UK's ability to engage with the European Union. Because I think the UK is kind of embracing the frames of reference that the US is using to engage with world politics. And those frames of reference are not useful to engage with the European Union. Is it going to change? I'm not sure. But this is an hypothesis because I'm not entirely sure. And I keep thinking about this question a lot these days.
That's fascinating. I have two questions. The first one is a question that I really wanted to ask you from the beginning of our talk. The last one is the question we put to all of our audience and all of our guests at the end of every session. So get ready for two combos.
Yeah.
My question to you is that if tomorrow morning, every transnational elite network between China and the West was magically severed because of United States policy, or Donald comes out, you're with us or against us, no more trading deal with the United States, forget about China. right? So if that happens, um, no more think tank events, no more, flow of finance between Shanghai and London. Would Europe suddenly rediscover the political will, do you think, to reindustrialize, to defend itself? Or do you think, as a matter of fact, that would be the last gasp for oxygen and breath for Europe where
Mm.
it is today?
A very
And,
difficult question.
and your difficult question, closing one, is if Juan Ferran Perez was to leave a Christmas gift for our audience, what would be his single most important piece of advice to cinephobes and to cinephiles?
Uh-huh. Okay, very good question. So the first question is a very difficult question. I think the answer. So let's say that this scenario unfolds. It could be that Europe might finally wake up and realize that the only way to remain relevant in this multipolar world is to pursue a serious strategy of strategic autonomy. And in my opinion, that will need to rest on several pillars. So promoting social welfare, deepening democracy, reindustrializing with robust state capacity, and adopting a more humble approach towards the global south. Honestly, I'm not sure the structure of world politics and the global economy even allows for that, but it's still a goal worth striving for. I believe that without these elements, Europe risks becoming irrelevant. And in that case, the geopolitical landscape could start to resemble something like medieval Europe, so fragmented, tense, and unstable. In fact, some Chinese commentators have even described Europe as an increasingly like an open-air museum, so a continent rich in history but struggling to shape its own future. So, yeah. And to answer your question, something that I will say to these people is that paradoxically, their ideas are going to basically lead to the decline of the West. That's the paradox. So I hear them and I understand why they argue what they argue. But paradoxically, even if they want to defend the West, even if they want to protect the West, the reality is that all those ideas are going to accelerate the decline of the West.
Right.
And I don't think that has been widely understood. And I think that if we want to be geopolitically relevant, I think that if we want to live in healthy societies, we need to really change the way how we think about politics. And I'm not entirely sure whether that's possible, but it's a good ambition to feel that we can build a better world with the rest of the countries. Yeah.
Ferran, your ability to so softly analyze such hard-edged issues is absolutely remarkable. Um, Selfishly, I'm really proud to have one of my colleagues from Durham as our guest, who can shine and show my partner here the strength of intellectual capacity in our School of Government, Durham University. You've definitely shown that. Ali had no doubt, I'm sure, but you've definitely shown that. Um, you know, your while your work rightly focused on China, is your ability to reflect on what that means for the rest of the world is truly remarkable. And your insights about the changing dynamics of global capitalism is breaking new ground, Ferran. And the advice you give our audience about waking up and abandoning some of their prejudices about the world is well taken. And Ali and I hope that actually our viewers take that to heart and begin to think slightly more constructively about their own place, the West's place in this changing world, and about how they can constructively contribute to it rather than try and delay the rise of a competing power, which seems to be a completely false paradigm as far as Ali and I are concerned. So you have shown the way. And Ali and I have also noted your current project on Kenya-China relations, which will have broader African-China consequences. So rest assured that you'll be back, not just to follow up the discussion about changing global dynamics, but also about how China is changing Africa, in juxtaposed to what Europe did to Africa. So
Yeah,
we are really grateful to you, Ferran, for taking the time and being so thoughtfully engaged with our BRI dialogues.
no, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and honor to be here. I really enjoy it. And yeah, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. Muchas gracias and Merry Christmas in advance.
Thank you.